It was the spring of 1955, and Hollywood was changing faster than anyone could understand. A new kind of actor had arrived in town. They did not stand straight. They did not project their voices to the back of the theater. They did not smile for the cameras the way the old stars did. They mumbled. They slouched. They wore torn shirts and stared at the floor when they spoke. And the biggest name among them, the one everyone was whispering about, was a 24-year-old kid from Indiana named James Dean. He had just finished filming East of Eden. The studios were buzzing. Magazines were calling him the next Marlon Brando. Directors were fighting to cast him. And in every smoky Hollywood club, every late-night dinner, every cocktail party in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, one question kept coming up. Who is this boy? And why does everyone care so much about him? But not everyone was impressed. Sitting in a booth at the Villa Capri restaurant on a warm April evening, the king of old Hollywood himself was about to break his silence. Frank Sinatra was 39 years old, at the absolute peak of his power. He had just won the Academy Award for From Here to Eternity 2 years earlier. His albums were selling millions. His concerts sold out in minutes. He owned this town. He owned the music. He owned the magazines. And he had no patience at all, for what he was seeing in this new generation. A reporter from a major Los Angeles entertainment paper was sitting across from him that night. The conversation had been light at first: music, Vegas, the latest film projects. But then the reporter asked the question that would change everything. He asked Frank Sinatra what he thought about the new wave of method actors taking over Hollywood. Specifically, what he thought about James Dean. Sinatra set down his drink. He looked at the reporter for a long moment, and then he said the words that would echo through Hollywood for the next 6 months. He said, "This kid does not know how to speak. He just mumbles. You call that acting? In my day, you had to project. You had to make the people in the last row feel every word. These kids today, they whisper. They scratch themselves. They look at their shoes. And we are supposed to call them stars. Give me a break." The reporter scribbled every word down. He knew he had something explosive. He had Frank Sinatra, the voice of a generation, openly mocking James Dean, the face of the next generation. By the next morning, the quote was on every front page in Hollywood. By that afternoon, it was on every radio station. By that evening, every single person in the film industry was talking about it. Frank Sinatra had declared war, but James Dean did not respond. He was at his small apartment in Sherman Oaks when his friend Bill Bast brought him the newspaper. Bill threw it on the kitchen table and waited for Dean to explode. He waited for the famous Dean temper to flare. He waited for the rage, the cursing, the threats. None of it came. Dean picked up the paper. He read the article slowly, one line at a time. He read it twice. Then he set it down, walked to the window, and stared out at the street for almost 5 minutes without saying a word. Bill finally broke the silence. He asked Dean what he was going to do. Dean turned around. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them. Something hard. Something focused. He said, "Nothing. I am going to do nothing." Bill could not believe it. He pushed. He said, "Jimmy, this is Frank Sinatra. He just humiliated you in front of the entire industry. You have to respond. You have to defend yourself. Every magazine in America is going to be writing about this for weeks. If you do nothing, they will think you have no answer. They will think he was right." Dean smiled, just a small smile, and shook his head. He said, "You do not respond to a man like Frank Sinatra with words. He has too many words. He has been collecting them for 40 years. He has written songs with them. He has charmed presidents with them. He has destroyed careers with them. If I fight him with words, I will lose before I even open my mouth." Bill asked him what he meant. Dean walked back to the table. He picked up the newspaper one more time, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. Then he said something that Bill would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "When the moment comes, I will know. And when it comes, I will not waste it." For the next 3 weeks, Hollywood waited. Reporters tried to corner Dean at every premiere. They shouted questions at him as he left restaurants. They followed him to the actor's studio. They camped outside his apartment building. What is your response to Frank Sinatra? Do you mumble? Are you a real actor? What do you say to the king of Hollywood calling you a fraud? Dean said nothing. Not one word. He walked past them with his head down, his hands in his jacket pockets, a cigarette hanging from his lip. Some reporters started writing that he was a coward. Some started writing that he had no answer. Some started writing that Sinatra had ended his career before it even truly began. But behind the silence, something was happening. Dean was preparing. He went to the actor's studio every single day. He worked on his voice, not to make it louder, but to make it deeper, more controlled. He practiced one sentence over and over again. He wrote it down in his notebook. He spoke it into a mirror. He whispered it to himself at night. He was not preparing a speech. He was preparing a single weapon, a single arrow, and he was waiting for the right target. His acting coach at the time, an older woman who had trained dozens of legendary performers, noticed the change in him. She would later say that during those 3 weeks, Dean had a kind of focus she had never seen in a young actor before. He would come into the studio, sit alone in the corner, and stare at the wall for hours. He would not run lines. He would not warm up. He would just sit there, breathing slowly, thinking. One afternoon, she finally asked him what he was working on. Dean looked up at her with those famous half-closed eyes and said, "I am working on one sentence." She laughed and asked him what sentence could possibly be worth 3 weeks of preparation. Dean did not laugh back. He said, "The kind that does not just answer a question. The kind that changes the question forever." She never forgot that conversation. Years later, after Dean was gone, she would tell her students that the greatest performance she ever saw James Dean give was not in a movie. It was the way he prepared for a single line he had not yet been asked to deliver. That target arrived on the evening of May 22, 1955. The event was the Screen Actors Charity Gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Whoa, it was one of the biggest nights of the Hollywood social calendar. Every major star in the city would be there. The room would hold over 600 people, and every seat was filled by someone whose name appeared above the title of a film. The ballroom was decorated in gold and red velvet. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Tables were arranged in concentric circles around a central stage, where a podium stood under a single spotlight. And, at table number 3, just 20 feet from that stage, sat Frank Sinatra. He was wearing a black tuxedo, a glass of bourbon in his hand, surrounded by his usual crowd. Dean Martin was on his left. Sammy Davis Jr. was across from him. Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart sat at the next table over. The Rat Pack was in full effect. They were laughing, telling stories, holding court. Sinatra was the center of the room. He always was. At table number 47, all the way at the back of the ballroom, sat James Dean. He was wearing a dark suit that did not quite fit him properly. His hair was a little messy. He was alone. He had refused to bring a date. He had refused to sit with any of his Warner Brothers colleagues. He had asked for the table farthest from the stage. He sat there nursing a glass of water, watching everything, saying nothing. A waiter approached his table twice and asked if he wanted anything stronger. Both times, Dean shook his head and asked for more water. He needed to be clear. He needed to be ready. His hands were steady, but underneath the table, His foot was tapping a quiet rhythm against the floor. 3 weeks of waiting, 3 weeks of preparation. And tonight, he could feel it in the air. Tonight was the night. The ceremony began at 8 o'clock. There were speeches about charity. There were tributes to fallen actors. There were awards for industry contributions. Through it all, Sinatra laughed loudly with his friends, occasionally glancing across the room, occasionally pointing in Dean's direction with a smirk. Some people noticed. Some people whispered. The tension was thick enough to taste. Then, just after 9:30, the master of ceremonies took the stage. He announced the next portion of the evening. A special segment where rising stars in Hollywood would be honored for their contribution to the future of film. The first name he called was James Dean. The room went quiet. 600 people turned in their chairs. Heads swiveled toward the back of the room. Sinatra slowly set down his bourbon glass. His smile did not disappear, but it tightened. Just slightly. Dean stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He did not rush. He did not look nervous. He walked through the room slowly, past table after table of legendary faces. He passed Bogart, who gave him a small nod. He passed Lauren Bacall, who watched him with curious eyes. He passed Marlon Brando, who was sitting near the front, watching with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. And then he passed table number 3. He did not look at Sinatra. He did not turn his head. He did not slow his pace. He just walked by, as if Frank Sinatra did not exist at all. Some people would later say that was the moment the room first felt the shift. The moment when something began to change in the air. Dean stepped up to the stage. He shook the master of ceremonies' hand. He accepted a small crystal trophy. He walked to the podium, and then he stopped. He did not speak. He just looked out at the audience. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The silence stretched and stretched until it became uncomfortable. People started shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. A waiter froze in the middle of pouring wine. Sinatra leaned forward in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips, waiting for this boy to embarrass himself in front of the entire industry. Dean adjusted the microphone. He looked down at the trophy in his hand. And then, finally, slowly, he raised his eyes. He looked directly at table number 3. Directly at Frank Sinatra. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Sinatra did not look away, neither did Dean. And then Dean spoke. His voice was soft, not quiet. Soft. There is a difference. Soft means controlled. Soft means deliberate. Soft means every single person in the room had to lean forward to hear him. And lean forward they did. He said, "Thank you for this honor. I would like to say something tonight. Something that I have been thinking about for a long time." He paused again. The room was so silent that the only sound was the gentle hum of the chandeliers. He continued, "There is a man in this room who said recently that I do not know how to speak. He said, I just mumble. He said he wonders if people like me can even be called actors." He paused again. Every single head in the ballroom turned toward Frank Sinatra. The Rat Pack had stopped laughing. Dean Martin was staring at his plate. Sammy Davis Jr. was looking at his hands. Sinatra himself sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Dean. Dean did not break his gaze. He said, "I have thought about that a lot. I have thought about whether I should respond. I have thought about whether I should explain myself, whether I should defend what I do, whether I should fight back." Then he smiled, just a small, sad smile, and he said the sentence that would be repeated in Hollywood for the next 50 years. He said, "Mr. Sinatra, I am not mumbling. I am just whispering in a world that has forgotten how to listen." The room did not move. 600 people stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. The silence that followed was the loudest silence anyone in that ballroom had ever heard. Dean was not finished. He continued, still soft. still steady, still looking directly at Sinatra. He said, "The old way of acting was to fill the room with your voice. You learned that on the radio, on the stage, in the big musicals, and it was beautiful. It was magnificent. I grew up listening to it. I still listen to it. But something has changed. The world has changed. People do not need to be shouted at anymore. They have been shouted at their whole lives. Their fathers shouted at them. The army shouted at them. The radio shouts at them. The advertisements shout at them. Everywhere they go, somebody is shouting." He paused. Sinatra had not blinked. Dean said, "What people need now is for somebody to whisper. Because when you whisper, they have to lean in. And when they lean in, they are no longer watching a performance. They are part of it. They are inside it. They are hearing it the way you hear your own thoughts. That is not mumbling, Mr. Sinatra. That is the future." He paused one more time, and then he said the words that would close the moment forever. He said, "You taught me how to feel music. Let me show you how to feel silence." He set the trophy down on the podium. He nodded once to the master of ceremonies, and he walked off the stage. The room remained frozen for almost 10 full seconds. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and then, from table number 3, something happened that nobody in that ballroom would ever forget. Frank Sinatra stood up, slowly. He stood up alone. While everyone else was still seated, he looked at James Dean as he walked back toward his table, and then Frank Sinatra began to clap. One slow, deliberate clap at first, then another, and then, like a wave breaking across the ocean, the entire room rose to its feet. 600 people, the most famous faces in American cinema, stood up and applauded a 24-year-old boy from Indiana who had just whispered down the king of Hollywood. The applause lasted for almost 2 minutes. Dean did not bow. He did not wave. He just walked back to his table at the very back of the room, sat down, and took a slow sip of water. He looked, for the first time all night, like he might cry. But he did not. He just sat there, holding the glass, while the applause finally faded, and the master of ceremonies tried to continue the evening. What happened next is the part of the story that almost no one talks about, because it happened in private. 20 minutes later, while the ceremony was still going on, a hotel waiter approached Dean's table. He handed him a small folded napkin. Dean opened it. There were 3 words written on it in fountain pen ink. The words said, "Meet me outside." There was no signature. But Dean knew. He stood up. He walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, and out into the cool California night. The valet was busy parking cars. The driveway curved around toward the side of the hotel, where a small private garden sat under a row of palm trees. Dean walked toward the garden, and there, leaning against a stone wall, smoking a cigarette in a black tuxedo, was Frank Sinatra. The 2 men stood there for a moment, looking at each other. Sinatra finally broke the silence. He said, "You are a real piece of work, kid." Dean did not answer. Sinatra took a long drag from his cigarette. He looked up at the night sky for a moment. Then he looked back at Dean. He said, "I have been in this business for 20 years. I have been called a lot of things, but I have never been called out like that. Not in public. Not in front of the whole town. You did something to me tonight that nobody has ever done." Dean said, "I did not mean to humiliate you, Mr. Sinatra." Sinatra laughed. It was a real laugh, not a Rat Pack laugh, a quiet laugh. He said, "Oh, you meant to. You meant every word of it, and you were right." He flicked his cigarette to the ground. He stepped on it. He looked Dean in the eye. He said, "I was wrong about you, kid. I was wrong about all of you. I have been so busy being the king that I forgot the world keeps turning. There is a new way coming, and you are it. And I do not have to like it to respect it." He extended his hand. Dean looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. They shook hands. It was not a handshake of friendship. It was something more important. It was a handshake of acknowledgement. The old generation passing something to the new one. Not a crown exactly. More like permission. Permission to exist. Permission to be different. Permission to whisper. As Dean turned to leave, Sinatra called out to him one more time. He said, "Hey, kid." Dean turned around. Sinatra said, "Do me a favor. Live a long time. The world needs more of you." Dean smiled. It was a strange smile, almost sad. He said, "I will do my best, Mr. Sinatra." Then he walked back into the hotel and rejoined the ceremony. 4 months later, on September 30th, 1955, James Dean was gone. He was 24 years old. He had completed only 3 major films. He had become an icon, a symbol, a legend, all before he had truly begun. When Frank Sinatra heard the news, he was at home in Palm Springs. According to the staff member who was with him that day, Sinatra did not say a word for almost an hour. He just stood by the window, looking out at the desert. Then he poured himself a glass of bourbon. He raised it, and he said, quietly, to no one in particular, the kid was right. He was always whispering, and we were always too loud to hear him. In the years that followed, Frank Sinatra rarely spoke about James Dean in public. But once, in a rare 1973 interview, a journalist asked him about the night at the Beverly Hilton, about the speech, about the handshake in the garden. Sinatra looked away for a moment. Then he turned back and said, "That boy taught me something that no one had taught me in 20 years of show business. He taught me that the loudest voice in the room is not always the one being heard. Sometimes the quietest voice is the one that changes everything." The story of that night has been told and retold for almost 70 years now. Some details have changed in the telling. Some have been exaggerated. Some have been forgotten, but the core of it remains the same. A young man, mocked by the most powerful figure in his industry, refused to fight with words. He refused to argue. He refused to defend himself in any of the ways he was expected to. Instead, he waited. He prepared, and when the moment came, he delivered a single sentence that did not destroy his enemy. It transformed him. Because that is the deepest kind of victory. Not the kind where you defeat someone, the kind where you make them see, the kind where you reach across the table of generations and say, "We are not so different. We just speak in different languages." James Dean did not silence Hollywood that night because he was loud. He silenced Hollywood because he was true. And in the end, that is the only kind of voice that ever really lasts. Not the one that shouts. Not the one that demands. But the one that whispers something so real, so honest, so deeply human, that the entire world has no choice but to lean forward and listen. If this story moved you, if you felt something stirring inside as you listened, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever stayed silent when the world expected you to fight back? Have you ever found that your quietest moment was your most powerful one? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to ring the notification bell so you never miss another untold story about the legends who changed everything, not with their volume, but with their truth.